In November 1910, 6 men boarded a private rail car leaving Hoboken, New Jersey late at night under names that weren't their own, with instructions not to call each other by their surnames. Not in front of the conductors, not in front of the waiters, not even when they were alone with one another. The train ran south through Virginia and the Carolinas and didn't stop for 30 hours, finally pulling into a small port on the Georgia coast, where the 6 men were transferred to a ferry and taken to a private island closed to outsiders. The club that owned the island was usually shut down in winter, but for this meeting it was opened on purpose. The regular staff dismissed and replaced with people who wouldn't recognize the guests by sight. And for the next 9 days, the 6 men stayed behind locked doors, arguing, drafting, rewriting, and arguing again over a document that 3 years later would become the law of the United States of America. That document now governs trillions of dollars. It determines interest rates that decide the cost of a mortgage in Ohio and the cost of borrowing for the government of Indonesia. It sits behind an institution whose balance sheet is larger than the GDP of every country on earth except 4. And it was written not in Washington, not in Senate hearings, and not by a commission of elected representatives, but by 6 bankers gathered at a billionaire's hunting resort in extreme secrecy on behalf of a government that didn't even know they were there. This is the story of how the Federal Reserve was created, and as will become clear pretty quickly, it's not the story the textbooks usually tell. To understand why the meeting on the island had to be secret, you have to step back and look at what America was like before 1913. The United States was the only major economy in the world without a central bank. Not because nobody had thought about it. They had. They'd tried. They created one twice, and they'd shut it down twice. The first Bank of the United States, founded in 1791, was closed 20 years later. The Second Bank of the United States, created in 1816, lasted just long enough to become the target of President Andrew Jackson, who waged war against it through both of his terms and finally destroyed it. When Jackson shut the bank down in 1836, he said a line that ended up in American history textbooks: "I killed the bank." For the next 80 years, America lived without a central bank, and that life was neither peaceful nor stable. Banking panics came regularly, with the inevitability of seasons. 1873, 1884, 1893, 1907. The mechanics of each panic were the same. One major bank would suddenly announce it couldn't pay out deposits. Fear would spread by telegraph faster than news, and within days, dozens of nearby institutions were collapsing. Millions of Americans discovered their savings had vanished. Farmers lost crop loans. Workers lost savings. Merchants lost working capital. The economy stopped for months, sometimes for years. The Panic of 1907 became the turning point. In October of that year, New York's Knickerbocker Trust, the city's third largest trust company, collapsed after its owner and his brother tried a market operation that ended in disaster. In 3 weeks, the stock market lost half its capitalization. Banks across the country were shutting one after another. Theodore Roosevelt's government was helpless. It had neither the tools nor the legal authority to stop what was happening. And then the country was saved not by Congress and not by the White House. The country was saved by one man, a 70-year-old banker named John Pierpont Morgan. Morgan gathered the heads of New York's biggest banks in the library of his mansion on Madison Avenue, locked the doors, and announced that nobody was leaving until they agreed to pool capital and stabilize the system. Meanwhile, he sat in the next room with a cigar and a deck of cards, playing solitaire while the younger financiers argued until morning. For several nights in a row, in the silence of that library, with its leather chairs and Persian rugs, the fate of the country was being decided. In the end, the bankers put up the money. $50 million here, $25 million there, together enough to stop the panic. The system held. Morgan became a national hero. But in Washington, once the emotions cooled, a sober realization set in. A country that depends on the mood of one private banker cannot remain a great power. Great powers need institutions, not personalities. And America had just been saved, quite literally, because Morgan hadn't gotten sick, hadn't gone away, and hadn't decided that he didn't care anymore. Next time, it might not be so lucky. In 1908, Congress created the National Monetary Commission and put Senator Nelson Aldrich, a Republican from Rhode Island, one of the most powerful figures in Washington at the time, in charge of it. Aldrich wasn't a random appointment. He was married to the heiress of a major industrial fortune, and his daughter was married to John D. Rockefeller, Jr., the son of the oil magnate and the richest heir in America. His contemporaries called him the general manager of the nation. People said no serious bill made it through the Senate without his approval. For 2 years, the commission studied the banking systems of Europe. Delegations traveled to London, Paris, and Berlin, examining in detail the structure of the Bank of England, the Banque de France, and especially the Reichsbank, the German central bank, which many experts of the time considered the most efficient of all. The commission produced 23 heavy volumes of reports, but its real task, the one nobody said out loud, was something else entirely. The task was to figure out how to build a central bank in America in a way that Americans wouldn't notice, because in 1910, the phrase central bank was almost an insult in the United States. Jackson's legacy was still alive. Populists in the Midwest, farmers' movements in Kansas and Nebraska, progressives in Washington, all of them still remembered the slogans of their fathers and grandfathers. Banks are tyranny. A central bank is an enemy of the people. Any bill openly carrying that name would never have made it through Congress. What was needed was a different wrapper, a different name, a different story. And in November 1910, Aldrich brought together the people who could invent it. The invitations went out personally, without secretaries, without a paper trail that could sit in an archive. 6 men. Aldrich himself, Paul Warburg, a partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company, one of the wealthiest bankers in New York, an immigrant from Germany who knew the Reichsbank from the inside, Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank, the largest bank in the country, part of the Rockefeller Empire, Henry Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company Morgan's right-hand man, Charles Norton, president of the First National Bank of New York, another pillar of Morgan's financial system, and Abram Piatt Andrew, assistant secretary of the Treasury, the only official government servant in the group. 6 men who, by the estimates of the time, controlled roughly a quarter of the world's capital between them. The instructions each of them received were detailed down to the smallest thing. Arrive at Hoboken Station in New Jersey on that exact evening, one by one without speaking to anyone. Bring a hunting rifle, for camouflage, so everyone would assume this was just a seasonal hunting trip for gentlemen. At the station, there would be a private rail car attached to a regular train. Get into the car without introducing yourself. Once inside, use only first names, never surnames. Call Warburg Paul, Davison Henry, Norton Charles. If anyone slipped and used a surname, the meeting would end. Everyone would go home. Years later, in his 1935 memoir, Vanderlip would write one of the most quoted admissions in American financial history. I'll quote it exactly, because it deserves to be heard exactly. I was as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen, or else all our time and effort would be wasted. If it were exposed publicly that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress. Elsewhere in the same account, he described the expedition to Jekyll Island as perhaps the most consequential conspiracy in American history. That's not me saying it, that's one of the participants writing it 25 years later, after many of them were dead and the need for silence was gone. Jekyll Island is a small patch of land off the coast of Georgia, connected to the mainland only by ferry. In the early 20th century, it belonged to a private club, the Jekyll Island Club, whose members included the richest families in America, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Vanderbilts, the Pulitzers, the Goulds, The club was exclusive in the literal sense. Membership was capped at 100 families, and getting in was harder than getting into the Senate. In winter, during hunting season, members came there to hunt deer, play golf, smoke cigars in the library, and discuss things that couldn't be discussed in New York. Because in New York, the press heard everything. In November 1910, the club was opened specially out of season. The manager was instructed to dismiss the regular staff and replace them with people who wouldn't recognize the guests by sight. Keep conversation with the guests to a minimum, and ask no questions. The 6 men were housed in the main clubhouse, a wooden mansion with terraces looking out over the ocean. That's where they worked as well, in one of the sitting rooms where maps, statistics, and draft proposals were spread across a table, and where over the next 9 days the document would be born. Warburg was the chief architect. He knew the Reichsbank. He knew its district structure. He knew how centralized control could be hidden inside a system that looked decentralized. He proposed the key idea. Not one central bank, which Americans would reject, but 12 regional banks tied together by a common board. Not central, but federal. Not fully government-owned, but quasi-private, with member banks as shareholders. Not one bank in the singular bit, but a system. Davison made sure Morgan's interests were protected in every line. Vanderlip protected Rockefeller interests. Norton protected another flank of the Morgan empire. Andrew gave the whole process an official appearance as a representative of the Treasury. Aldrich chaired the meetings, connected the factions, and settled the disputes. 9 days, 9 nights, 6 men who between them controlled a quarter of the world's capital, negotiating how to divide up the future central bank of the United States in advance, before that bank even existed. By December, when they were heading north again, one by one, again in the private rail car, again with hunting rifles for show, they had a document in hand. Later, it would be called the Aldrich Plan. The Aldrich Plan was introduced in Congress in early 1912, and it failed. Not because of its contents. Almost nobody had even had time to read those. It failed because of the name. By then, the name Aldrich had become toxic. The progressive movement in both parties, Republicans and Democrats alike, had built a campaign against him in which he was portrayed as a Wall Street man, as Rockefeller's relative, as someone working for the banks and not for the people. Anything carrying his name was politically doomed. In November 1912, the Democrats won the presidential election. Woodrow Wilson moved into the White House. A Princeton professor, a former governor of New Jersey, a politician from the progressive wing who had promised voters he would fight the money trust, the financial monopoly of Wall Street. Under Wilson, the Aldrich Plan couldn't survive as the Aldrich Plan. But the plan wasn't thrown away, it was rewritten. That's what makes this story especially revealing. The document born on Jekyll didn't die, it changed clothes. Same structure, same 12 districts, same mechanisms, same governing principles. But under a new name, in new packaging, and now signed not by Aldrich, but by a Democrat, Senator Carter Glass of Virginia and Congressman Robert Owen of Oklahoma. Instead of the Aldrich Plan, the Federal Reserve Act. Instead of a private bankers association, a public-private partnership. Instead of a central bank, a Federal Reserve System. Warburg, the same man who had written the plan on Jekyll, advised Glass and Owen during the rewrite. Many paragraphs of the new law matched the old one word for word. Wilson pushed the Federal Reserve Act through Congress in December 1913. In the final days of the session, right before the Christmas recess, when a significant share of senators and congressmen had already gone home. Debate was brief, press coverage was light, and the opposition didn't have time to organize. On December 23, 1913, President Wilson signed the bill. The Federal Reserve System of the United States was born. A few years later, already seriously ill, Wilson would write a line in private correspondence that became part of American folklore. It's quoted in every other book about the Fed. Historians argue about the exact wording, and different sources preserve different versions, but the meaning is consistent across several documents. Wilson wrote, "I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated in private hands. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." The president who signed the Federal Reserve Act later regretted signing it. That's not me saying it. It's a documented part of his biography. 112 years have passed since the night Wilson put his signature on the law. Over those years, the Federal Reserve has become the most powerful financial institution on the planet. It issues the dollar, the world's reserve currency, used in around 80% of international trade settlement. It sets interest rates that determine the price of a mortgage in Cleveland and the cost of borrowing for the government of Brazil. Its balance sheet is more than $7 trillion, larger than the GDP of every country in the world except the United States, China, Germany, and Japan. When the chair of the Federal Reserve gives a press conference, markets across the world hold their breath. Trillions of dollars move depending on one word and one sentence spoken by one person. But the structure laid down on Jekyll is still alive. 12 regional reserve banks, exactly the number Warburg drew on his map in November 1910. A board of governors appointed by the President of the United States, but with terms long enough to extend beyond presidential cycles, making them effectively independent of elections. Private member banks that own shares in the regional Federal Reserve banks. This isn't hidden information, it's the official structure. The regional Federal Reserve banks do have shareholders, and those shareholders are commercial banks required to purchase that stock. A chair whose words, as I said, move trillions in both directions and who is formally accountable to Congress, but in practice operates with enormous autonomy. It's important to make an honest caveat here. The Federal Reserve isn't a conspiracy theory. It's an institution that has changed enormously over more than a century, layered with laws, reporting requirements, constraints, and reforms. Many of its actions are rational, technically defensible, and aimed at legitimate economic goals. The Fed managed the country's currency through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the oil shocks of the 1970s, the financial crash of 2008, and the pandemic. And in none of those episodes did the United States fall into hyperinflation or total financial collapse. That's not nothing. That's a serious achievement. But the fact of its origin, the fact that the institution managing the world's currency was designed by 6 men on a private island in strict secrecy without the public knowing, and that one of the participants himself described it as perhaps the most important conspiracy in the history of the United States. That fact remains historical, not conspiratorial. It's in memoirs, in archives, in academic studies. It doesn't need to be dug up, it just needs to be known. Today, there's a museum on Jekyll Island. The clubhouse still stands. The room where the 6 men wrote their plan in November 1910 is open to visitors, and on the door hangs a sign, Birthplace of the Federal Reserve. Tourists walk in, take pictures, read the note on the wall, and move on. Most Americans have never heard of that room. Most don't know that their central bank was designed not in Washington, not in Philadelphia, not in New York, but in a hunting club on an island off the Georgia coast, in a room with wooden beams and leather chairs. Most don't even stop to think that one of the most important institutions on the planet began with 6 men boarding a night train and being forbidden to call one another by name. Not because they were criminals. None of them broke the law, but because they understood one simple thing. If anyone found out what they were doing and who was doing it, the law would never pass Congress. Secrecy wasn't a quirk. It was the condition for success. And it worked. 3 years after that trip, the United States got a central bank that was presented to the public as not a central bank, not private, not controlled by Wall Street, even though in practice it was all of those things at once. And that structure, born over 9 days in November 1910, still helps govern the world economy more than a century later. I'm not telling you the Federal Reserve is good or bad. That's too big and too complex a subject to settle in a 20-minute video. But I am telling you that institutions governing trillions don't appear out of nowhere. They're born somewhere, and that somewhere has an address, a date, and names. In the case of the Fed, the address is Jekyll Island, Georgia. The date is November 1910, and the names are Aldrich, Warburg, Vanderlip, Davison, Norton, and Andrew. Knowing that doesn't make you a conspiracy theorist. Knowing that means understanding how power actually works. Not in textbooks, not in civics lectures, but in real life. Had you ever heard of Jekyll Island before this video? If yes, where did you first hear about it? A book? An article? An older relative who brought it up over dinner? Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. I'll pin the most interesting answers. See you in the next one.